Hey y'all. I thought it would be a good idea for me to present a slideshow presentation that I made last summer. I made this presentation to try to appeal to some of the leading sexologists that female autoandrophilia likely exists. And so that's what this talk is going to be about. Um, it's called Science of Autosexual Trans Identity Among Females. And I'll be presenting both direct and indirect evidence that argues for the fact that females can have these sort of internalized sexual attractions. If you don't know who I am, I wrote this book called Autoheterosexual Attracted to Being the Other Sex, and it explains internalized heterosexuality that makes you get sexually attracted to being the other sex. And this umbrella label of autoheterosexuality includes female autoandrophilia and male autogynephilia under the same heading, under a shared heading. Much how homosexuality is the same term regardless of whether you're talking about gay men or lesbians. And just, I'm sure all of you already know this, but in case you don't, autoandrophilia is a sexual attraction to being a man. Autogynephilia is a sexual attraction to being a woman. The gist of autoheterosexuality is that usually people have an externally directed heterosexuality and alloheterosexuality that makes them sexually attracted to other people. But in a subset of heterosexuals, for one reason or another, that attraction, some or all of it, gets internalized and directed towards themselves. And so they get attracted to being um, basically whatever it is they admire in the other sex or gender. And this can, of course, lead to transsexualism. It's the most common cause of transsexualism. Just to be clear, when I say the most common cause of transsexualism, this is already established for male to female transsexualism. Blanchard established the two-type typology, and Lawrence showed that in Western individualistic countries, the most transsexuals report non-homosexual orientations, which means that they're likely of autogynephilic etiology. Analogous research into female to male transsexualism has not been done yet. But I personally think that autoandrophilia is a major driver of female to male transsexualism. And if you're skeptical about that, maybe you'll be a little more open to it after seeing this, the argument I present here. So I'm going to show both direct and indirect indicators that females can have autosexuality. The direct indicators are firsthand narratives, say like by Sullivan, for example, who he was a trans man who wrote diaries throughout his life, and they have since been published. Excerpts from them have been published. Another direct indicator of female autosexuality is that in sexology studies, when various cohorts of people are asked about whether they're sexually aroused or have ever been aroused by cross-gender fantasy or cross-dressing, people of both sexes, some proportion of people of both sexes endorse those measures and report that, yeah, basically that would be sexually interesting to me. And I'm also going to show some indirect indicators of female autosexuality to sort of come at this from another angle. Basically that the sort of effects that you would expect from internalized sexual attractions, from autosexual attractions, as I call them, they show up in both sexes. That basically both sexes participate in subcultures around erotic target identity inversions. That's what the ETII means on that slide. And that there's phenomenological experiences such as gender euphoria or phantom anatomy or mental shifts that happen in both sexes and that, as far as I can tell, these are associated with they arise in autosexuals and are putatively caused by autosexuality. So I'm going to show that those arise in both sexes, which sort of indirectly would indicate that there's a female analog of male autogynephilia. And that analog, of course, would be female autoandrophilia. So there's 4 good cases, at least like pretty elaborate cases that are published that you can refer to that I'm going to present here. One is Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe. This book created a lot of controversy, I think, a year or two ago because 1 or 2 of the pages in it has a picture of someone filleting a strap-on dildo, and this book is in some schools, in school libraries, and so conservatives kind of freaked out about that fact, which I'm sure increased sales, and I hope that Maya is pleased with the sales they got. I'm also going to be other good cases are Elsa B. From this really old sexology paper that was originally published in 1923. It depicts autoandrophilia, as far as I can tell. And there's Mrs. G, which is, you'll see. I'll skip ahead. So this is that book by Maya Kobabe, Genderqueer, and the offensive page that got a lot of people in an uproar is pictured there. In the important thing about why I'm showing this here is in this book, on page 157, Maya Kobabe draws themselves encountering the concept of autoandrophilia, and they find this concept revelatory, and they feel that it applies to them. They also recount how around pubertal age of 11 or 12, they started fantasizing about having a penis. In another picture that I didn't include here, they also show themselves like holding a bunch of grass they would hold like a bunch of grass in their crotch, sort of like to simulate having a penis, and that helped them fantasize. At least that first time they did it. They also would put socks down their pants and manipulate the bulge as if they had a penis. And then they'd fantasize about gay male sex, which, can you blame them? Look at those guys. Anyways, they also depicted themselves experiencing gender euphoria from transvestism. As you can see in these pictures, they draw themselves quite excited, and you can even see the little blush marks in the image on the right. They're basically getting the warm fuzzy feels from finally wearing boys' underwear for the first time. That's what this drawing is depicting. The first time they went shopping for underwear. Elsa B's narrative. I'll just use he, him pronouns for Elsa B because I have a hunch he would not be mad about it. So Elsa B, he wrote, he didn't write, but like in his, he had some sessions with a psychotherapist, and this is what ended up in a paper. And he supposedly said, as regards clothing, I may say that simply putting on men's clothing gives me pleasure. I even experience lustful satisfaction in dreams of this act. He also said, it affords me downright sexual pleasure. Simply putting on my suit can provoke an orgasm. The transvestiture has a far greater pleasure value in my eyes than any intercourse, and I could easily forego the latter in favor of the former. And that significance of that second quote is that there's this idea with paraphilias that, like a genuine case of paraphilia is sort of a rigid, enduring sexual interest that is atypical, and the strength of it exceeds one's conventional sexual interests, the regular sexual attraction to other people, like adults. And so the interesting thing about that quote of saying that the transvestiture has a far greater pleasure value in his eyes is sort of indicates that he had a paraphilia related to that transvestiture, which is autoandrophilia. Mrs. G, um, my book I call Mrs. G, Mr. G, and he he was a wild person. Robert Stoller, he was a patient of Robert Stoller, and Robert Stoller dedicated an entire book to him called "Splitting: A Case of Female Masculinity." It's just almost entirely just transcripts of sessions between them. Um, it's really interesting. If you have an interest in autoandrophilia, I recommend checking out that book if you've already read Lou Sullivan's diaries. Lou Sullivan would probably be a good place to start if you were looking for narratives. And Mr. G said, I finally pulled the Levi's over my crotch and up to my hips. I let go of the material I was holding to pull them up and put one hand to my mouth to stop any sound I might have made, and the other between my legs as I was experiencing one of the most profound orgasms. There he was recounting his first time putting on Levi's blue jeans, which he forged checks. He forged his mother's checks to buy them from the store. And he got punished for that, but he thought it was worth it. And in one of his sessions with Stoller, he was talking about his interest in a man's penis, and he said, I think that really is a beautiful thing. I really wish it was mine. What is there that makes me want it inside of me and makes me want to have one? I would say the answer to that is autoandrophilia, but people disagree. Lou Sullivan, um, yeah, he has quite a few good quotes in his diary. There's a few slides here with some of the best in terms of their ability to indicate the presence of autoandrophilia. Lou Sullivan said, if I had a mastectomy, I'd have to beat off 24 hours a day because I'd be so turned on by myself. And he also wrote, just spent the afternoon in a long masturbation session, just like I'd done nearly all last summer, imagining I'm a boy and masturbating endlessly. He left the bar one night alone and wrote in his diary, and he wrote, went home, and so I had to sleep with the boy I am and make love to myself like I have every night. I pretend I'm a boy in bed and think how it feels. I've done this for years, as long as I've had sexual feelings. I have to go to bars often if I'm to find myself a boy to sleep with. In times I can't, I can become a boy to sleep with. Which is, if a natal male said the sort of the gender flipped version of this, it'd be quite obviously autogynephilia. So I think that this is also an indicator of autoandrophilia. He also said, when I don't have a boyfriend, my urge to dress and pass becomes strongest. I think it's because when I'm alone, I have no man to pretend I am, no man to live through vicariously. And this sort of is reminiscent of the dynamic competition that Blanchard talked about between a man's autogynephilia and his conventional heterosexual attraction to women, how sort of the women within and the external women sort of are like in competition with each other. Like he almost can't decide which one should draw his attention and his efforts. Lou Sullivan also wrote, I like to make love like a man. I want to be a beautiful man making love to another beautiful man. And he wrote, "When I have sex, I have to fantasize I'm a man making love to this other man before I can have an orgasm." Um, which, while this sort of narrative also lines up with um, Blanchard's concept of autohomoerotic gender dysphoria, because it's about male male eroticism. Um, as you saw earlier, there was also other quotes about just say like beating off at the thought of getting a mastectomy that are not necessarily indicative of that. So I think the auto homoeroticism concept isn't quite right, and I think that it's more of just the interpersonal aspect of autoandrophilia. Sullivan also wrote a couple times in his diary about this like really short, tiny woman that he met. He said, if I met her again, the girl that is, I think I'd make a move because it was so nice. She was so small and she made me feel so big or something. And it was the first time I felt I could be her boyfriend. And the interesting thing about this is it's meta attraction. Like with autogynephilia, you can have a sexual attraction to being a woman with a man, and that man's masculinity helps you feel more feminine in contrast. And this quote, I think, is indicative of the autoandrophilic equivalent of where Lou Sullivan was attracted to the tininess of this girl because it made him feel big, and that therefore he could be a boyfriend in relation to her. So it's sort of like a contextual, gender affirming based sexual attraction. Um, those are some of the good narratives. And now I'm going to talk about some of the direct indicators of female autosexuality. So, females, they endorse measures in sexology studies that measure transvestism and cross gender fantasy, basically cross dressing and cross dreaming, so to speak. Females endorse these measures, and it's usually not at exactly the same rate as males, but it nonetheless happens. So, as we can see in this table, the females, although their percentages of endorsing these measures are usually smaller than the males, it's not always the case. And also, just nonetheless, it's never 0%. There's always some percentage of them endorsing these measures. And, a sort of a devil's advocate argument could be that, that's part of the lizardman's constant, say, like what Scott Alexander has written about, that when you give surveys to people, there's going to be some few percentage of people that endorse a measure no matter how ridiculous it is, and regardless of whether it applies to them. And while that is always a possibility, um, I I think that generally sexologists see these measures of male sexuality. They take them as indicators of autogynephilia, but then don't necessarily extend the same logic to these results from females. But I think it's, even though female and male sexuality are different, it's I think it's very unlikely that um, all the females that are endorsing these are somehow lying or incorrect about themselves. I think the more likely explanation is that they're accurately reporting on some of their experiences or feelings that they've had. And there's historically there's been more studies typically measure transvestism more, just because the concept of transvestism sort of founded the whole category of trans with respect to gender as we now understand it. Um, so there's comparatively less measures of direct cross-gender eroticism aside from clothing, but it's starting to be asked more often now in studies, thankfully. And as you can see, these percentages between females and males here with regards to cross dreaming, like cross gender fantasy, they're much more similar in the prevalence of the endorsement than the cross dressing ones tend to be. And as far as I can tell, females are less likely to have the interest in the clothing. That seems to be, some of them do have that interest. As I showed, Elsa B reported sexual arousal from dressing in a suit. But just statistically, it seems a little less likely in comparison to how male autogynephilia is expressed. There was a really large paraphilia survey, 5,000 people of each sex for a total around 10,000 people of the Czech population. And the cool thing about this one is it asked about both transvestism and autogynephilia and autoandrophilia. So because of that, I can sort of compare the relative endorsement rates of transvestism and cross-gender fantasy along the 5 dimensions of sexuality that they measured. This is a great study. If any of you are sexology nerds, I recommend reading this paraphilia prevalence survey. I refer to it all the time. So I've included the percentages here reported in that Czech survey for females and males. And as you can see, usually the males, pretty much, actually, I would say in all these instances here, there's a higher proportion of males reporting either transvestism or autogynephilia, which is that lines up with plenty of sexology findings that have found that such behaviors is more common in males. However, in females here, it was never 0%. There's always some percent of them that report analogous cross-gender eroticism with regards to clothing or just cross-gender fantasy. And in particular, the preference and arousal columns here, you can see that for autoandrophilia and autogynephilia, there's kind of like a 1-to-2 ratio where, like, for every 1 female autoandrophile here, there's about 2 male autogynephiles. So it seems that although females are much less likely to report transvestism, maybe they're roughly about half as likely to report autoandrophilia. And so I'm gonna show some results here from a small trans race survey I did. While writing my book, I wanted to write a trans race chapter, but I couldn't find any empirical studies on trans race. I could find plenty of social justice-y, moral-based papers that talked about whether it's problematic, but none of them were like, hey, what is this thing? None of them were scientific, basically. They were political. So I did a little trans race survey. I asked the respondents about their cross-gender eroticism with regards to, like, the idea of being their identified race, having its body, being socially treated as that thing, dressing as it, or behaving as it. And as you would expect, all of the trans race people on average reported elevated rates of attraction to people of their identified race and less to people of their birth race. So they had a cross race, like, racial preference. These graphs here are just going to be for the female subset. As you can see, there's, like, some of them reported that it was not all arousing, say maybe around 40% or so. But most of them endorsed some amount of arousal to various aspects of cross-gender fantasy, whether it was being that race, having its body, being treated as it, dressing as it, or behaving as it. And this plot shows something similar. Instead of the intensity of arousal, it's the frequency of fantasies. And again, most of them reported being another race in their sexual fantasies. Roughly similar proportions said usually as said never. Keep in mind, just a reminder, this is a very small n, just 13, but it's at least a good start for um, supporting the argument that there's a type of transrace identity associated with internalized race-based attraction. I also I asked them about race euphoria, this because that seemed like a good way to indirectly sense the presence of a physiologic response to cross-race stimuli that wasn't about sexuality, so would be more likely to avoid socially appropriate response style. And indeed, a higher proportion of them endorsed these measures of race euphoria than endorsed the ones on sexuality. And quite a few of them said they had very strong race euphoria from these various aspects of cross-race embodiment. And because I think I compared the degree of race euphoria reported based on whether they admitted the cross-race eroticism or denied it. Because I think asking about euphoria has a lot of promise for being an indirect indicator of autosexuality that maybe even clinicians could use to avoid the socially appropriate response style that often accompanies asking about sexuality. So I found here, again, remember tiny n, but regardless of whether they admitted or denied cross-race sexuality, they reported similar degrees of race euphoria, which suggests to me that some of them were not reporting accurately that they had been aroused by it, or some of them were interpreting their arousal as euphoria rather than a sexual thing. But either way, I think this holds promise as an indirect way of asking about autosexuality in a way that will bypass denial. So another way of coming at this sort of argument for female autoandrophilia is to show that females participate in subcultures and have forms of dysphoria and identity pertaining to trans identity along other dimensions besides gender, such as body integrity dysphoria, aka transabled, or adult baby diaper lovers or age regressors, which are trans age, or furries, therians, and otherkin, which are former trans species identity, and trans race, as I mentioned. It's basically like if females can have these rarer types of trans identity, then and if the males who have these types of identity are generally explained with erotic target identity inversion theory, then I think it's logical to conclude that the females also can be described with erotic target identity inversion theory, and that these rarer forms of trans identity are indicative of erotic target identity inversion. And if so, then it kind of implies that if females can have these rarer types of internalized sexual attractions in trans identity, then for sure they can have the heterosexual equivalent of these, which would be autoandrophilia. So, yeah, if you buy into the idea that females can have these other forms of internalized sexual attraction, then it's kind of like a corollary that they could also have autoandrophilia. So here's a table with the percentages of females in various body integrity dysphoria studies. They range from 8 to 20%, as you see in this table. I was working on a paper recently I must have gone overboard looking for all of the studies on this. There's way more than just these amount of studies, but they generally find this same prevalence that maybe like a fifth or a sixth of the people who have body integrity dysphoria are female. And if these forms of trans identity are byproduct of erotic target identity inversion, you would also expect the females in these subcultures to have elevated rates of transgender identity. Because if you can have, the idea is that if this is all caused by internalized sexual attraction, that sort of brain quirk that Blanchard called a erotic target location error, then like if this basically if it is the result of those things, then someone that has internalized sexual attraction in one dimension of their sexuality would be more likely to have it in other dimensions. Basically, like if they were sexually attracted, someone who is sexually attracted to being an amputee would have an atypically high rate of also having internalized heterosexuality, either autoandrophilia or autogynephilia. And so these tables are just from some informal Reddit polls from within the body integrity subreddit. And as you can see, the proportion of respondents reporting transgender identity is uncommonly high. In the general population is generally maybe 1%. But here you have a very high proportion of them reporting that. Whereas, as you see in this top chart here, 7% of respondents were FTM, 23% just identified as woman, which I'm going to assume was just cis woman, so to speak. And as you can see, there's roughly 3 cis women for every 1 female to male person here. And of course, some of the non-binaries are probably female too. Perhaps a majority, because among non-binary identity in general, roughly 80% of people are natal female that have non-binary identity. And as you can see in both sexes here, there's atypically high rates of transgender identity in both of these tables. There was one really good study that was about eroticism associated with body integrity dysphoria, and they asked people with this type of dysphoria whether they had ever been aroused by fantasizing about being disabled or pretending to be disabled, or by people who had disabilities. They were asked both the allosexual and autosexual equivalent of disability-based attraction. And males were more likely to report sexuality associated with it. 80% of them did. However, it wasn't 0% of females that reported it. Around 40% of females in this study also reported prior sexuality associated with it, which is what you'd expect if females could have erotic target identity inversions with respect to disability. Females are also in the adult baby diaper lover subculture. They tend, since age, sort of the paraphilic age-based attraction is much more common among males than females. This is like a very big sex difference in paraphilias that I've noticed that might be the biggest sex difference in terms of paraphilias, that males are much more likely to have sexual attraction to extreme youth. However, 5 to 10% of these ABDL respondents were female. And in community subreddit polls, again, there's some females, around 10%, it looks like, in these. And the proportion of the females who are also transgender is quite high. Like in this top table, it's 3% are FTM versus 7% are non. It's a huge overlap. Like I said, the general incidence of transgender identity in the general population is around 1%. So for among the females, for it to be, maybe it's hard to guess because I'm non-binary in the other categories, but roughly of the females who respond to this, 40% of them were also transgender. So again, there's a huge overlap between there's intersecting types of trans identity happening here, which is what you'd expect if erotic target identity inversion was behind it. This table has just some ABDL studies that were conducted within the ABDL community. These weren't outside researchers. And again, you see 7 to 10% of respondents report being female. And they also show slightly elevated rates of transgender identity in this. Bitter Terrence Gray did this really cool paper report. I don't know what you call it. It's on a webpage at infantilism.org. It's called Girls, Boys, and Diapers. And as part of this, he plotted the recalled age of onset of ABDL symptoms in terms of, say, like the desire to be a baby or desire to wear a diaper, like the earliest recalled instance of these sort of inclinations. And it's overall, the line for females here in the plot is quite bouncy because it's a much smaller n, but the overall pattern is similar, that there's like a global maximum at age 5 when a lot of them first report their first instance of ABDL inclinations. There's a local maximum around age 12, which is a very pubertal age, which is what you'd kind of expect there to be a peak there, because if this is caused by an internalized sexual orientation, then the onset of puberty, which is generally associated with the onset of sexual feelings and sexual drive, it would bring out those inclinations. And yeah, pretty much by then, most of them had already had some inclinations, like even before puberty. And then thereafter, it starts becoming very few who report their first instance of it after puberty. But yeah, so this is the developmental trajectory you would expect for internalized sexual orientations, just because this is the same developmental trajectory as orientations in general, that people have the first signs of them generally before puberty, but once puberty hits, they sure as hell are feeling some of the feelings associated with it. Therians. Some Therians are female. In some of the very earliest polls on the alt.horror.werewolves Usenet group, roughly a quarter of respondents were female. And like, this is at a time when in the 90s, internet usage was heavily skewed towards males. Males were the early adopters of internet usage. So it's actually kind of a surprisingly high percentage in light of that fact. And as you can see with this later poll from the 2012-2013 Therian census in this table, the proportion of females is actually, they're a majority, almost 2/3 in the 2013 Therian census. And this is what you'd expect if females could have internalized zoophilia, where they're sexually attracted to being an animal, and they develop trans-species identity as a byproduct of this. This table is from the Alter Humanity and Sexuality survey by a Therian named Lopuri. I don't know how to pronounce it, but they're a bonobo Therian, which is actually a pretty rare kin type among people with trans-species identity. Usually it's canine species, feline, and then next most is some sort of reptiles, often dragons. But yeah, they're bonobo, which is pretty cool. So most respondents in this survey reported sexuality consistent, like species-based sexuality, both allosexually and autosexually. They were consumed porn or found their kin type attractive, and most of them reported that in a sexual romantic context, they would like to be treated as their kin type, which was what you'd expect if autosexuality was behind this. And a lot of them said that they're their kin type and their sexual fantasies, which again is totally consistent with the autosexuality hypothesis. Another sign that erotic target identity inversions are at play here is, like I said, there's the overlap between transgender and non-gendered forms of trans identity. As you can see, roughly a significant proportion of respondents to various Therian and other kin surveys report that they have a super binary form of gender identity that's neither female nor male, which is another indicator that gender variance is present at elevated rates among Therians and other kin. It seems to be about roughly 1/3 of Therians and other kin are also transgender, which is, yeah, as shown in this table, which is an astonishingly high percentage. Like I said, the base rate in the general population is roughly 1%. So for it to be for a third of them, basically for it to be like 30 times as common in this population, it sort of suggests that there's a similar underlying cause, which I think is the internalized sexual attraction. Yeah. Now, another way I come at this argument for female autoandrophilia and autosexuality is that since autosexuality can cause sort of these unique phenomenological experiences, such as gender euphoria or feeling phantom anatomy, or feeling like you have the consciousness of another type of entity, I think these phenomenological indicators can be used as indirect signs of autosexuality. For those who don't know, gender euphoria is basically when you get the warm fuzzy feelings, just comfort, joy, feeling of love, maybe a little elevated heart rate, maybe some goosebumps. Just basically you get the warm fuzzies in response to perceiving that you're embodying the other gender. And phantom anatomy is when you feel anatomy corresponding to the type of thing that you're attracted to being. Here I'm not talking about phantom anatomy from amputations or anything like that. I'm talking about a sort of proprioceptive form of phantom anatomy that occurs without any surgeries. It's just, you just have this feeling of having that sort of anatomy. And I'll show some examples shortly. So gender euphoria was reported quite early on. Not with this language, but there's instances in Hirschfeld's book where narratives point towards this. For example, Hirschfeld wrote that about one transvestite, when he put on fancy dresses, it resulted in no erections, only a pleasant feeling that ran through his body. Another transvestite said, again and again, a wonderful feeling penetrated me when the silk skirts rustled around me. Elliot Page, in his memoir, he was caught by surprise by gender euphoria. He said, during the beginning of the pandemic, my mask collaborated with my early spring wardrobe to alter my reflection in the window. Like my shadow, I saw the boy. Unlike the shadow, the boy looked back at me. A thrilling vibration throughout my body I was not anticipating. It was jarring in a good way. A rush. What the actual fuck? My reflection never gives me a rush. He was really caught by surprise when he was walking by a window, walking his dog with his mask on, and he saw a boy looking back in the mirror, and it caused like this intense rush through his body, which I think a strong physiologic reaction like that is an indicator that there's some sort of mechanism and psychological mechanism that can trigger it, which I think is likely autoandrophilia, because this happened after he saw himself as a boy, and he did later transition. And that's what his memoir is about, is his gender journey, so to speak. Yeah, and he's not the only one that has euphoria. One of my favorite genre of female to male posts in the FTM subreddit is about silly things that give you gender euphoria. Some of these threads have hundreds of responses, and some of them are quite silly and funny. I highly recommend checking it out. If you search these subreddits for the word euphoria, you will find them, and they are cool and good. Some of the common themes in these things are just doing guy things, lifting heavy stuff, opening jars, manspreading, being called sir, getting the head nod from other guys in public. Men out there, you know what I mean. Yard work, doing grilling, being handyman. They love men's hygiene products. That has given them gender euphoria. They've gotten gender euphoria from seeing themselves with body hair, facial hair, having veins in their hand, being handed the check at a restaurant, having animals react to them as though they are men, because there's some animals that like one sex or the other, and so it's especially rewarding, I imagine, if an animal is seeing you as the gender you aspire to, because they're not bound by human social norms at all. They're just based on their perception. And they also got gender euphoria from wearing boxers, wearing shorts in winter. Very, very guy behavior. So this image is from a Therian comic that explains phantom limbs. As you can see, there's the phantom anatomy that comes out of the person's body, and they sort of feel this as part of their body. The Therians otherkin call these phantom shifts. More generally, I think it's good to call them phantom anatomy, because it's more clear about what it is. Shifting is language that's particular to the Therian and otherkin communities. In the 2013 Therian census, they were asked about how often they experience mental and phantom shifts and the type of phantom anatomy they've had before. As you can see, the vast majority of them reported history of mental shifts and phantom shifts. Mental shifts are when they feel like an animal inside, when their animal self comes to the fore and they have animalistic thoughts, feelings, urges, instincts, etc. And interestingly, the proportion reporting mental and phantom shifts, it seems similar between these different types of shifts, which makes me wonder if the propensity for shifting itself is like it's kind of its own discrete thing. As you can see, the prior phantom anatomy, it's usually tails, ears, muzzles, paws, things like that. And those are often the same sort of things that, say, furries or Therians, they'll wear gear, they'll wear ears or animal tail to symbolize their animal self. So, yeah, that all makes sense. In Maya Kubabe's book, they mentioned briefly how they experience phantom anatomy. They said that I assign sensation to a body part I don't have all the time. Sometimes I can almost feel where it would be resting against my thigh. And yeah, phantom anatomy is reported by FTMs and MTFs. And, it's quite easy to think, since most male to females, especially online, are of autogynephilic etiology, it's pretty safe to assume that this is a byproduct of autogynephilia. So I therefore think, what if that same phenomenon in females is indicative of autoandrophilia? And the interesting thing about the phantom anatomy is that it's not a super well-known thing, so it's unlikely that these reports are coming from social contagion, because as you can see from many of these titles, there's people that are just asking unprompted, like, hey, does anyone else experience this thing? Like, they're wondering if they're the only one that experiences it, which suggests to me that it's not social contagion causing this, it's arising from within. There was one small study about phantom penises, transsexuals. It found that 62% reported having felt vivid phantom penises and phantom erections for many years. These are post-mastectomy trans men. There's a really big trans phantom anatomy survey that had about 1,000 females, a few hundred males. Among females, 51% reported prior trans phantom anatomy. Half of them. That's even more than the males. 39% of them reported prior phantom anatomy. But overall, similar proportions. And they presented this in a bunch of different tables. I've collected it into one here to kind of simplify it. As you can see, 43% of the females in the study reported having felt phantom penis before. Which is, if autoandrophilia is behind this, that's not surprising. Penises are quite central to sexuality, and they're super sex related. Like, of course, they're going to feel that. Likewise, the males here, they had lower percentages actually, where 14% of them had reported phantom breasts and 26% had felt phantom vagina. The interesting thing here is, regardless of what type of phantom anatomy is reported, the vast majority of them said that there was erotic sensation associated with it. The study authors, for some reason, obscured the natal sex specific figures here. I assume they didn't want to lend any credence to Blanchard's theory, which, it's frustrating, but it's easy to work around this foolishness. As you can see, the vast majority reported erotic sensation associated with phantoms. For penises, 86% of the people who had felt phantom penises said there was eroticism associated with it. And the onset of phantom anatomy is similar between sexes here, which suggests that there's a similar underlying condition causing these. Roughly a quarter of both sexes said that they've felt phantoms basically back to their earliest memories. Another quarter said it started around adolescence. And then among females, another quarter said it started in relation to a sexual experience. And then others reported that it started after hormones or after surgery. But for the most part, this arose as one of the earliest memories or since adolescence, and is completely separate from whether they transitioned. It just arose independently for both sexes. Mental shifts are, you get this feeling, like for autogynephrology, you get this inner feminine feeling. You get in touch with that feminine entity in your head, and you sort of like let it like run your self system for a little bit. It's a pretty nice feeling. It's cool and good. I recommend it if you can mental shift. It's nice once in a while. In my book, I proposed that that cross-gender consciousness embodiment is another subtype of autosexuality, analogous to anatomic autogynephilia or transvestic autogynephilia. That this psyche, autogynephilia and autoandrophilia, is about having the mind of the other sex, having its thoughts, feelings, perceptions, senses, things like that. And I came up with that idea after learning about Therians and seeing their mental shifts and seeing how it related so much to some narratives I'd seen in Hirschfeld's book, and also related many ABDL people reported age regression. I realized there was this commonality across these different types of trans identity where people were having the feeling of cross consciousness embodiment of having the mind of another type of entity. And what made me really think this was a category in particular is that there's a criterion for gender dysphoria in the DSM that is a strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender, and none of these mapped onto the pre-existing known subtypes of autosexuality. So I figured that there was one missing, and that there's one pertaining to the mind, and that this is what is responsible for mental shifts, and that this is probably the seed that grows into that inner sensation of cross-gender identity. Which, if true, like, this is probably pretty important. Richard F. Doctor, he wrote that for most transvestites, there appears to be a temporary exchange of gender identity associated with the cross-dressing experience. This change is egosyntonic and pleasurable. This is that sort of temporary embodiment of like another type of entity that I'm talking about when I talk about mental shifts. But Paige's story was this episode of NPR's Invisibilia that talked to a trans woman about her experience with what I'm calling mental shifts here. They don't have the terminology for that, but as you can see, they describe it. The narrator says in female mode, she was much more expansive, and sights, sounds, smells, likes, dislikes, they were all different. And Paige said that when I'm female, all my emotions are like just really vivid, like colors. And the way I see the world and the way I interpret the world is different. So it shows sort of switching between these two mental modes. Sullivan, in his diary, he wrote, for the last 3 to 4 days, I feel like I've been walking around in a daze. I think it's because I have a strange identity feeling going on because of my leather jacket. It's really great, though. I really love it. I like the feeling of wearing it and the identity crisis that comes with it. Mr. G said, if I wear any men's boots and pants, I feel strong, confident, and capable of taking whatever or whomever I want sexually. I do not wear boots exclusively because of the aggressive feelings and the effect on my attitude. There's been a couple good studies on mental shifts in bigender people. The authors called it a like alternating gender incongruence. And they report in the abstract that participants frequently reported that gender states were accompanied by changes in thinking, emotion, and mood, as well as shifts in sexual orientation. That latter thing about sexual orientation, I assume that's meta attraction there, causing that. So they had 73 people in their study. 29 were female, 44 were male. 71% of them reported prior phantom anatomy. As you can see here in these tables, the frequency of gender switches, most of them had it at least daily, or not most, 38%. Another 41% said at least weekly. So for the most part, it was happening. These mental shifts are happening at least weekly for people that identify as bigender. And, I'm assuming that people who identify as bigender, that they're likely of autosexual ideology, because autosexuality sort of creates this second self inside of you. And then there sort of can be this tug of war between the two selves over who's going to be in charge and run your life. And these two different modes of operating, they sort of feel different psychologically. So yeah, in total, I think female autosexuality is a really parsimonious explanation for why females report sexual interest in masculine embodiment in firsthand narratives, and why questionnaire items that measure cross-gender sexuality consistently find that some females endorse those measures. I think this is a good explanation for why females participate in ETII, erotic target identity inversion related subcultures, and also have those various forms of trans identity and dysphoria, and why among these rare types of trans identity, there's extremely elevated rates of transgender identity. And also that it's a good explanation. Female autoandrophilia and autosexuality more broadly is a good explanation for why females can have phantom anatomy, mental shifts, and gender euphoria. And yeah, that's all. That's my it's basically my argument for why female autoandrophilia not only exists, but also that more broadly females can have autosexual attractions and develop corresponding forms of trans identity. I think It's just the simplest explanation. Um, and yeah, I'm curious to know what y'all think. So yeah, let me know in the comments. Um, thanks. Bye.